Today, we're diving into a completely different way to think about AI risk. It's a concept called cognitive operating architecture. And honestly, it might just change how you see the role of AI inside any organization. Okay, so let's just jump right in. When you hear the words AI risk, what pops into your head? For most of us, it's all very sci-fi, right? Rogue AIs, biased algorithms, systems making some kind of catastrophic error. But what if that's not the real danger? What if the biggest risk has nothing to do with the model itself? So here's the core idea we're going to unpack. Most of what we call an AI failure, well, it's not really about the technology at all. It's actually a failure of institutional design. The problem isn't the robot, it's the invisible blueprint for how we let that robot think for us. And that leads us to the first really big problem here. Our whole approach to AI governance today seems to be based on a complete misdiagnosis. We're running around treating the symptoms, but we're totally missing the underlying disease. I mean, just look at how we're handling AI governance right now. It's all about the model, right? Make it safer, align its values, wrap it up in ethical rules, and make sure it's compliant. Now, don't get me wrong, all of that stuff is absolutely essential, but it's all built on top of one very, very shaky assumption, that at the end of the day, humans are still the ones making the final call. But here's the thing. That assumption often just isn't true anymore. You see, organizations aren't just using AI as a fancy new tool. They're doing something way more profound. They're engaging in what's called delegated cognition. They are literally handing over the act of thinking itself. And that is a huge distinction. Think about it. A traditional tool, like a hammer, it just executes an instruction. You use it, and then you put it back in the toolbox. But an AI system? It generates judgments. It's not static. It learns, it evolves. And you don't just put it away. It gets woven into the very cognitive fabric of the organization. And this is how authority just silently slips away from humans and over to the machine. It's this quiet, gradual process that nobody really notices. The model's outputs are consistent and seem reliable, so people start to trust them. That trust slowly hardens into reliance. Pretty soon, just doing what the model says becomes the default action. And eventually, overriding that default takes so much work, so much justification that it basically becomes an obligation to follow it. Nobody ever voted on this change, it just happened. So what you end up with is this massive gap. It's this structurally ungoverned zone. On one side, you have the incredible technical power of the model. On the other side, you have the formal, on-paper authority of the company's leadership. And right there in the middle, a dangerous, unmanaged space where real authority just drifts away with no one watching the ship. So if this dangerous gap exists, what's supposed to fill it? Well, the argument is that we're missing a whole layer of our institutions, something called a COA, or Cognitive Operating Architecture. A Cognitive Operating Architecture, or COA, is the formal structure that's meant to manage this whole process of delegated thinking. The key here is that it's not about controlling the AI itself, it's about controlling how the organization delegates work to it, relies on its outputs, and, crucially, makes sure someone is always accountable. This quote really gets to the heart of it. A COA doesn't micromanage every single thing the AI does. Instead, it governs the conditions for reliance. It's like setting the rules of the road for thinking itself. It asks the big questions, like, when is it actually okay for us to trust this system? For which kinds of tasks? And, maybe most importantly, how do we pull the plug if we need to? This table does a great job of showing where COA fits in with everything else. You know, you have AI safety, which is focused on the model's behavior, but COA is focused on the institution's reliance on that model. You have ethics, which gives us principles. COA builds the actual structure of authority that puts those principles into practice. It's the missing layer that makes sure that no matter how smart the system gets, responsibility never just evaporates into thin air. So what happens when this architectural layer just isn't there? Well, the failures that follow aren't random accidents. They become predictable, recurring problems. You could almost call them institutional pathologies. Without a COA, you get these same 5 failure modes popping up again and again. Automation bias stops being just a personal quirk and becomes embedded in the culture. Oversight becomes a meaningless rubber-stamping ritual. People start using the AI to launder authority. You know, the model made me do it. And accountability diffuses until no single person is responsible. And finally, delegation becomes irreversible. The organization literally forgets how to function without the machine. Okay, I know these concepts can feel a little abstract, so let's make it really concrete. Let's imagine a bank that decides to use a new AI system to help with its credit lending decisions. It all starts out so innocently, right? The model is just an advisor. But pretty soon, the loan officers figure out it's way easier to just agree with the model than to build a case against it. And that's how reliance takes hold. Before anyone even realizes what's happened, the model's recommendation is the decision. Then, inevitably, a bad loan gets approved and accountability just vanishes. The officer blames the model, the risk team blames the data, and eventually, the bank is so dependent on this system that turning it off isn't even an option anymore. They've achieved irreversible delegation. And here's the kicker. The AI model itself could have been technically perfect. It could have passed every single safety and bias test you threw in it. The failure here was 100% architectural. The bank delegated the act of thinking without ever building the structure to govern that delegation. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the path forward? What does all this mean in practice for leaders, for organizations, and even for the folks trying to regulate this stuff? Well, the COA framework completely reframes what we mean by responsibility. Leaders and boards are always being told they're responsible for AI. But what does that even mean? It definitely doesn't mean they all need to go out and get PhDs in machine learning.
Their job is to own the architecture. They need to be the ones asking these kinds of questions. Which decisions are we as an organization actually willing to delegate to a machine? Under what specific conditions? How do we take back control if something goes wrong? These aren't technical questions. They're fundamental questions of power, structure, and accountability.
And that, right there, is the ultimate shift in perspective that we need. We have to stop treating AI governance like it's a technical problem for the engineers to solve and start seeing it for what it is, an architectural problem for leaders to design. You know, this changes the whole game for regulators, too. Instead of trying to play this impossible game of whack-a-mole, trying to regulate every single new model, they can shift their focus. They can move from trying to dictate technical fixes to requiring architectural accountability. They can start asking institutions one simple question: show us your cognitive operating architecture. You know, when you boil it all down, this whole idea comes back to a very simple but incredibly profound truth. For years now, our institutions have been slowly handing over cognition to machines, but they never had a name for what they were doing, and because they couldn't name it, they couldn't manage it. By finally giving this missing layer a name, a cognitive operating architecture, we make it visible, we make it real, and we make it something that can finally be designed, debated, and governed. And that single act of naming is the very first and most important act of governance in the age of AI.